Hello, my name is S.K. Williams, and while this shan't be my final video, it is one of the final videos I made for this channel, when this channel was the only channel on the tube of you that I had and serves as the main channel. And there really won't be a transition. There won't be a transition when I create a new channel, but then try and establish it and make it maybe grow a little before switching from this channel as the main channel to the others. As I'm recording this, I'm already making a new channel to be my main channel. And the reason for that is due to the fact that I can't word freely here. I can't say what I want. Granted, some of the restrictions that were placed on me have more than likely been lifted. Many people have been reporting that channels that were locked for years have come back. Gaggle has admitted to not permitting the speech of conservatives. However, I have noticed that when I post comments, the vast majority of them do not go through. I have also noticed that I still have certain difficulties with certain videos. I don't think the restrictions are as restrictive as they once were. But I don't know where the limits are now, and I'm retaining most of my precautionary workarounds. Not all of them. I'm no longer talking like a zany, crazy cartoon character, which is what I was doing toward the end of my run here. At the same time, the unintended consequence of our technological age has been that the majority of people now turn to social media for their news or even their entertainment. This happened for a multitude of reasons. Reasons that probably should be discussed and which I intend to discuss on the new channel. But part of it owes to the fact that the technology simply exists and it allows a sort of democratization of media that didn't exist before. If I wanted, for instance, to get my message out there, I would probably have had to work for a newspaper at the very least in the past, and for radio or television or movies or something like that. And even then, my employer would probably make it difficult to say everything without risking my employment, unless I actually owned a media franchise, like a television station or a movie studio. But it was very difficult to get mass distribution without those things. And while you could technically own smaller ones, many gospel tracts companies, for instance, exist that are very small but have good outreach. They don't really have the same coverage. But with the advent of the internet, anyone was allowed to speak all of a sudden. And this frightened the people who ultimately ran our society. It's changing. I don't think they have as much control as they used to. But society really wasn't run along the mythos of democracy, and it never can be. Not really. But historically, the people who had the money to donate to academic institutions, to research institutions, to finance electoral campaigns, and of course, who produced our entertainment, and who controlled the source of our news. I lump those two together because they use the same medium, usually newspapers, magazines, radio, television, movies. They're using the same things to distribute their information, be it entertainment or news. But the people who ran those things was a small group of wealthy individuals who generally were also of the same social circles and holding to similar ideological positions. They favored one point of view over another. Now, the system wasn't perfect and it wasn't uniform. They would occasionally allow something that went against their ideals as a collective whole because one of their members defected or there was this loner who managed to get wealthy who isn't part of their circle who got into it, or something along those lines. Likewise, there was always some disagreement within this circle. There's also the fact that the wealthy elites in the past, in living memory for a lot of people, while they have always been to some degree sheltered and removed from the common man, had more contact with the common man and more in common with the common man and with the general society in the past than they came to later on. They became wealthier than anyone in history ever had been and more secluded by their ideologies. And the more they turned inward to their own inner circle, and the more walls they put between themselves and the general population, the more they convinced themselves that they were needed to bring about this great world revolution that had been spoken of since the Enlightenment, and that in its present iteration was fully realized as an ideology and as a philosophical position in the 19th century. It comes from the progressive era. It comes from thinkers like Ludwig Feuerbach. It comes from people like Karl Marx. It comes from people like Anne Besant and Charles Bradlaugh, both of whom were famous as atheist activists but were also social activists. And Anne Besant is still regarded as a famous atheist activist, even though she became an occultist later, but that's another matter. There is also a bit of a conspiratorial tone. Not in the modern conspiracy theory sense, but in the sense that two disparate forces that you wouldn't think would go together worked together to achieve an end, which created this bizarre hybrid between socialist idealism and capitalist elitism. And I intend to go into greater detail about this topic as well on my other channel. But in the early 20th century, people like John Dewey, who imagined reshaping America via its educational system into a model socialist society, teamed up with the Rockefellers, one of the wealthy capitalist families, the richest man on earth at the time. Where Rockefeller agreed to finance and back Dewey and his educational reforms, because both of them while they had very different points of view about how society should run as the end result, both wanted an educational system that did more than just teach facts, but that also conditioned people to be factory workers, working against a bell that tells you to move class. That's like the bell at work telling you to move jobs. And the main goal of the modern educational system was to train workers to go in the factories. Because John Dewey, an atheist, a socialist, someone who had brought into the idea of a perfected world along the lines of Marx, believed, as most atheists did back then, that nature was something that could be conquered and exploited by man. A belief system we now view as conservative and right-wing, and what the Christians would believe, not what the atheists who want to protect the environment would believe. But it was a very different time in the early 20th century. Christians were more about preserving God's creation through nature, whilst atheists were more about the factories in the good old days. Because the factories were the living embodiment of science and progress and man's advancement to get a better life. And Dewey thought that conditioning people to be factory workers, to work in this system, would also condition them to work in a factory-like society where everyone has their job, everyone has their place, everyone does what they need to do as cogs in this giant collective machine. Rockefeller, of course, didn't want a socialized society. He did not want to be plundered of all of his wealth and power and status. But he did want factory workers, and he didn't mind if the plebeians became his factory workers that made him wealthy. And that's why we have this bizarre society today. And it wasn't just these two. There were other things that went into it, and I'm leaving a lot of detail out because it's not the main focus of this video, and because I don't know how much of it I can say here. But we live in this bizarre hybrid ever since between 1900 and 1920, where we've blended socialist ideals with capitalist ideals. And we have this almost two-tiered society where we have the capital elitists who had always to some degree been separated from the common man by their wealth and position and their connections and played by different rules. But here we have a stark contrast that is greater than it was even in the Victorian era or even in feudal Europe with the lords, which people always complain about, where it became a cultural understanding that certain exceptions were made for the fabulously wealthy and fabulously powerful, and that they literally play by an entirely different set of rules with an entirely different social structure, which allows them to do things to maximize their profits, to gain fabulous wealth, to live in lavish luxury, to fly private jets, whilst at the same time they can lecture us, telling us not to fly planes at all, even to go on holiday. They want us to stay home. They don't want us to eat meat, which is fine by me. I'm a vegetarian, but I'm just pointing this out because it would damage the environment. And they want us to all move to cities and pay rent for apartments instead of owning homes. And the ultimate, of course, would be what we hear from the World Forum for Money Matters. Another term that I can't really use safe. Well, couldn't use months ago safely. I don't know if I can now, but I'm not going to push it. The Davos crowd under Klaus Schwab. Where the famous quote, "You will own nothing and you will be happy," which is often attributed to Schwab. But which really came from an article promoting this idea. But it is nevertheless the basic gist of what was being planned by the great Rothschild, where we reset things in a great fashion, in case you couldn't understand what I just said. It's still in line with that thinking. And if it were actually implemented, we would live in a society where we rent houses. We may not actually pay monthly rent. We may not have to go to work, earn money, and come home and then pay rent to a landlord. Landlords would be abolished. But rather, due to our social credit, our social position, the state would basically own our house and we would be assigned it, and we'd be allowed to keep it so long as we provide a function. With exceptions. Some people would have to own land and own buildings to get things done, because we're not full-blown communists, we're not even full-blown socialists. We are going to allow certain private property, but you don't need to own your own land. You don't even need to own your utensils. If you want to use something, you can order it online and a drone will bring it to your domicile. You can use it for when you need it and then deliver it back. Perhaps some things would be in the domicile permanently, like a microwave, but for the most part you will live in a pod and rent an appliance when needed and then give it back when you're done. You might rent it for a few hours, and the people who really own it will gain fabulous wealth from your use of it. This sort of stratified society as an end goal tends to be what they were going for, and precisely because of this hybridization of socialist idealism and capitalist idealism. And I'm not one of those people who's going to blame one or the other. I'm not going to say socialism is beautiful and pure and good when practiced, but it has been corrupted by the evil capitalists. Nor am I saying capitalism should work, that is pure, no more corrupting it with socialism. I think that this new idea is a merger of the two, and I really don't like either socialism or capitalism. Something most people don't understand is that there are alternatives to socialism and capitalism. And both socialism and capitalism were actually condemned by the Catholic Church in the 1870s. But it doesn't really matter. I'm talking about what is right now. And what we have right now is a society that allows capitalism to make various people very wealthy and very powerful. But a socialized system that gives enough welfare programs to keep the other peoples below them placated unless they run out of money. Like with the current US shutdowns, or what's happening in France, or to some degree what's happening in the UK. The UK has other problems though, and the riots are not primarily, and by riots I mean demonstrations that don't damage anything, perfectly fine. But therein lies the point. Most of the people in the elite spheres that control the old media, that largely control the tech companies, that largely buy off the politicians and get money from them from their resources. They largely came out of a climate where even higher education that they went to, even the private education, taught this sort of utopian vision of the future that comes out of progressivism, that comes out of humanism, that's largely why secular humanism even exists. Secular humanism is, while we see it as a non-religious life stance now, or at least a non-religious philosophy as it used to be called, it's really just a religion. And it's the religion that is driving the modern powers that be. That's why in both Canada and the UK and a few other countries, they're promoting death with dignity, or dignity in dying, which is really a euphemism for offing people. I can't use the real word, but it is basically one of those verboten words that I'm talking about. I am, of course, referring to assisted slurricide, where we unalive people by their request because of intrinsic medical conditions, which we know will be expanded and abused, and we know people will be bullied into doing so. But if you read the Second Humanist Manifesto from 1973, aided slurricide was, in fact, one of the principles that was argued for in the Second Humanist Manifesto. And if you read all of the Humanist Manifestos, you will see the ideals and goals and principles that drive the modern political forces and that drive the modern social forces. They are all rooted in humanist thought. And don't let any sort of talk about how when a new manifesto comes out, the old one is superseded get in the way. You can't really supersede ideas that easily. And most of these people don't so much read the manifestos as they read works by other people who read the manifestos or who share their ideals. So the ideas keep getting passed on whether or not they're included in a new manifesto or not. But the manifestos do help if you want to understand the world around us, because the Humanist Manifestos encapsulate the goals and agendas and beliefs of the people who hold power. This includes people like Peter Thiel, who claim to be Christian. They're all to some degree influenced by the matrix of humanist thought that came out of higher education. The only question is the exact interpretation of it, and ultimately people are products of their environment. So all of the modern elites grew up in a world with this two-tiered, one set of rules for the elites, another set of rules for the plebeians, has always existed. We're basically ancient Rome with patricians and plebeians, with the difference being that we don't so much care about nobility of blood. We care about it to some degree, more so than we like to say. If someone has a famous father or a famous mother, we care about that. And if they inherit wealth from it, we don't genuinely hold it against them in any socially consequential way. Some people may call them nepo babies and such, but they are still given a great deal of power. That is how Sam Harris came to prominence, for example. His mother created Golden Girls and was Hollywood royalty, and he gets handed the easy life with his mother's fortune. And he never really had to earn a position. Even his books, when he started writing with the New Atheism, were largely handed to him, with success virtually guaranteed. The reason being because the New Atheism was never a grassroots movement. It was AstroTurf. It was financed by the Edge Foundation and all four members of the Four Horsemen of the New Atheism, Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett, all had the same literary agent. This is why they all make the same arguments. That, plus they all belong to the same humanist organizations that made the same arguments for years. They were basically commissioned by their literary agent, John Brockman, to write their books. And the basic arguments were given to them by their organizations, by the Edge Foundation, by the humanist organizations they belong to, and by Brockman himself, who also served as an agent, if you will, for those groups. Albeit in that way, agent means one who works for them rather than one who gets your book out. And since these people are the people who also own the media, the new atheism was hyped up in the media, and the hype worked, especially since the people in society were willing to listen to the message after 9/11, and especially on the left with the presidency of George W. Bush, who was being touted as some sort of Christian theocrat who's no different than the Taliban wanting to impose a form of Sharia law, only it would be Christian Sharia law in America, and it would be no different than Iran and Saudi Arabia. Oh, scary, scary, scary Bush. And of course, George W. Bush was never really like that, but this is how he was portrayed. But we were very heavily manipulated, and it wasn't that difficult to do so, especially if you join the new atheism, because you're being told that the mere fact that you're an atheist who rubbishes religion, this proves how intelligent you are and how rational you are and how you're a free thinker using critical thinking and logic and evidence. When really all they were doing was quoting the same dull arguments and silly slogans they heard other atheists do, and this is what you see in the modern atheist movement. All they do is troll Christians, and really that's all they go after is Christians. And it's not because it's the most popular religion where they live, it's because Christianity, not religion, was always the real problem, because people in the West are more inclined to be Christian than they are to be Muslim, although that is changing due to immigration. Christianity genuinely stands in the way of progressive values to a far greater degree than Islam does. Many Muslims who come from third world countries are perfectly fine with progressive values to some extent. Perhaps not the LGBTQIA2S whatever stuff, maybe not the rainbow things, but they go along with other issues. And that's the point. It was always mostly just an anti-Christian movement promoting left-wing progressivist humanist values, and those are the same values that are promoted by the media, by academia, and largely by politics around the world. That's why Quebec says that it is a secular province with secular values and wishes to abolish public prayer, because that's an affront to secular values. You don't want to see people praying in public, for crying out loud. This is a secular culture with secular values. We don't want to see prayer. You have your churches and mosques for that. Oh, you still have religious freedom. Just don't pray in public. And plenty of atheists, of course, love to point out that Jesus himself said not to pray in public, which isn't actually true. Jesus said don't pray to be seen by men like the publicans and the Pharisees did. But he never said public prayer in general was wrong, and it would make no sense for him to, since public prayer was part of the Jewish life. What Jesus was actually critical of, when he said to go and pray at home quietly or in your closet, wasn't a condemnation of all public prayer. It was condemnation of praying for show to be seen of men. Public prayer is not always just for show, and it's not always just performative. And that's what Jesus was actually criticizing. But they always say, Jesus said not to pray in public! And it really doesn't matter, because it misses the point. If secular people who have no religion are so insulted by the sight of public displays of religion that we shouldn't even be allowed to pray in public, because it's sort of an obscenity. You should pray in places where religion is allowed to be practiced, but religion should be limited to church or mosque or temple or maybe perhaps your home. But you should not have religion shown in public. It's an affront to secular values. Then what you really have is the same sort of state-mandated religion that they were complaining about with the Taliban and Sharia law and Christian Sharia law and the Christian theocrats. The only difference is we're supposed to play pretend that because it's secular rather than religious, it's okay. Because historically, when we said that we want to separate religion from government and allow religious freedom, we did so under the understanding that it is wrong to impose beliefs on people that they do not hold, or to try and force them into beliefs they do not wish to join. We should allow freedom of choice. But it's no longer about freedom of choice. Now it's about religion in itself being fundamentally wrong and irrational. And while we as a society have agreed to religious freedom, we should recognize how dangerous religion is and make certain that religion is kept out of the state and society. And if you must be religious, you must be religious at home and in your church or mosque or temple. But you should not be religious in public, and it should not affect the way you vote. You should always vote according to secular values and secular principles. And as we all know, secularism has values now. Because as much as we are told that secularism is nothing more than neutrality toward religion, the very fact that people will openly talk about secular values means that that can't be true. If secularism has values, and if those values are offended by seeing public religiosity, if displays of religion are an affront to secular values, or at the very least, if public displays of religion are an affront to secularism, then secularism is not neutral. Secularism is telling us that our public spaces should be free of religion. Why should our public spaces be free of religion? Because it's an affront to secular values. Equally, we know that we can't oppose a woman's health care, a woman's reproductive freedom, which is also how we must phrase it. And I dare not use the real word on this channel, considering the restrictions I have faced in the past. But let us just say that there are baby bye-bye policies for women who do not desire motherhood. You see, a secular society allows woman's reproductive freedom. It is a secular value that a woman has a fundamental freedom to say bye-bye to her unborn baby. And if you oppose it, you must be opposing it because of religion. And we must keep religion out of government and religion out of society. If you must be religious, keep it in your home and your place of worship, but it is not in the public square. And if you oppose it for religious reasons, well, keep in mind, your religion is not you. You should embrace secular values. And if your religion conflicts with secular values, you must lay aside your religion and agree with secularism. So we must all support a woman's reproductive freedom to say bye-bye to her baby before the baby is born, because it is inherent to a secular society, and it is a part of secular values. In order to have a truly secular society free from religion, we must support women's reproductive freedom. The same thing exists with same-sex marriage. It is an affront to secular values to oppose same-sex marriage, or more broadly, to oppose homosexuality. Secularism tells us that there's nothing inherently wrong with homosexuality, and that we should permit marriages between people of the same gender. This is what secularism tells us. And if your religious beliefs conflict with these values, you must lay aside your religion and go with the secular. No other argument is given other than the fact that when religion rules society, we get tyrannies. We get a theocracy. And in a theocracy, we have no rights, no freedoms. It would be like Saudi Arabia or Iran under Sharia law. It would be no different if Christians did it. Creating a Christian theocracy under Christian Sharia law. It would be no different. We would have tyranny. Theocracy. Look at the Dark Ages in Europe where they were ruled by theocracy, and religion stopped science and reason from advancing, and people had to live under the squalors of kings in a feudal system where they had no rights. Only with secular liberal democracy have we had freedom. And of course, this is all tosh and nonsense. You see, I don't have freedom because I cannot oppose secular values. If my religion teaches me that something is wrong and secularism says it is right, I am obligated to lay aside my religion and go with secularism. I am allowed to have my religion. I'm allowed to go to whatever ritual led by people with funny hats that I want to, listening to some picture, listen to some nonsense about a fictional God character loving me. I'm even allowed to pray. And if my religion requires dietary restrictions, well, they won't force me to eat what my religion tells me not to. But the minute my religion requires me to contradict a secular value, I must realize that my religion is inferior to the secular and lay aside my religion for the secular. The modern story is not that it is wrong to impose beliefs on people they do not hold. The modern narrative is that it is wrong to impose religion and only religion on people. And that it's perfectly valid to impose secular values because they are not religious. Because they are rational and based on science, reason, and critical thinking. Secular values can be mandated precisely because they are not religion. And this is what makes them so irritating. Because secular values are only non-religious by definition. I know that sounds weird because we usually say, by definition, to mean that this is what something is innately. If I say, for instance, that by definition a man needs food to live, that means that it is an inherent fact. But in this case, I'm using it in a different way. When I say that secularism is by definition not religion, I don't mean that inherently it is not religious and it is preposterous and absurd to call it religion. I mean that our society has decided the word secular means not religious, therefore secularism can't be a religion. It's really just sophistry. It's a silly word game we're playing, where we have created an entire framing of a debate about how religion leads to tyranny and theocracy and is dangerous and should be restricted. We will allow freedom of religion, but we must live in a secular society. And we are allowed to impose secular beliefs on people because of this danger of theocracy if we don't. Without really debating why people hold certain views. In fact, we are basically obligated in this society, even though people who don't agree with this still oppose it. The powers that be tend to try and obligate us to frame all of our discussions within this matrix. Even when it comes to baby bye-bye for women who don't want motherhood, what we end up with is a society that tells us that the only possible reason we can oppose baby bye-bye policies is because of religion. And that the only reason religion tells us that baby bye-bye policies are good is because religion degrades women. The whole argument is framed as one about a woman's reproductive rights, a woman's reproductive freedom. It's about telling a woman what to do with her own body. If, of course, you object to that and point out that you just don't want the baby to go bye-bye and that you're actually doing it on behalf of the baby, well, that's just an excuse. In reality, it's because you view women as inferior to men, you view women as property, you're trying to make women second-class citizens, you're trying to tell women what to do with their own bodies. So the debate is between those who believe women should be free to make choices about their own bodies and people who think that women are second-class citizens who should be controlled and have no freedoms. This is absurd, of course. This is a nonsensical issue. But it makes sense when you realize that even though we have defined the word secular to mean not religious, and we understand a secular society as one in which is freed to some degree from religion, government isn't run by religion, has no religious influences, society isn't religious, in reality, secularism is a religion in its own right. And it always has been. There is no such thing as a non-religious person. When I say that, in this context, I don't mean there are no people who merely lack belief in gods and the supernatural. There really aren't people who lack belief in God. Atheism is a belief that no gods exist. But atheists have successfully redefined the word atheism to mean a lack of belief in a God, and it helps them because now they don't have the burden of proof when they call you delusional for believing in a fictional character and talk about how sad it is that you have an imaginary friend as an adult. Because calling God imaginary and fictional is not making a claim that God doesn't exist. Neither is calling you delusional for believing in God making a claim that God does not exist, because the word atheism is by definition a lack of belief in a God. But therein lies the point. It really doesn't matter if you define atheism as a lack of belief in a God or a belief that there is no God. It really doesn't. Because even accepting that there are people who do not believe that God exists, who actually believe we live in a materialist universe where there are no gods, there's no supernatural. When I say secularism is a religion, I don't mean secularism appeals to gods and the supernatural. The idea that religion means one believes that a God exists, and that being an atheist means you have no religion, is itself an obscurant way of looking at things that prevents us from seeing the real world. Because in a way we're seeing atheists as distinct from religious people and different from them, when at a fundamental level they're not. Their actual specific beliefs are different, and they lead to different actions and different consequences. But at the end of the day, we are dealing with beliefs. Atheism itself is a belief. And the secular values that atheists tend to hold to, or that people who erstwhilst claim to be religious and are not atheists hold to, ultimately mandate how we behave, how we think, how our culture and society is shaped. And an insistence on secular values ultimately prevents real discussion on topics that secular values have mandated that we hold, like baby bye-bye policies, like same-sex marriage. And keep in mind, this narrative that some people are religious and other people are not, and that we need a secular society free from religion, is precisely why we can't admit that our society is so poisoned by a religious belief system. Or if we do admit it, it's in the context of trying to get us back to real secularism, getting us to true secularism. As if the problem is not with secularism itself, the problem is with this counterfeit that is not real secularism, but is actually a form of religion. All forms of secularism are a form of religion. They are forms of godless religion that teach materialism, but they are forms of religion. Secularism is a religion, and secularism has beliefs, secularism has values, secularism mandates certain behaviors from us and certain affirmations from us. And a secular society who embraces secular values would look a certain way and function a certain way. It would not look and function the way secularists imagine it would work, with this Star Trek-like utopia. It would actually end up being an authoritarian, controlling dictatorship. We know because it's been tried before with communism, and it was so bad that modern atheists, like the New Atheist, have to insist that it had nothing to do with atheism and was totally not secular and was actually a form of religion. But let's face reality. There's really no fundamental difference between the communists and what they believed and what modern-day atheists who promote progressivism believe. They all believe in the same dialectic materialism. They all believe in the neo-Hegelian concept of matter in motion, in the struggle for existence, which is language you see throughout factism and communism, which is ironic because we keep calling factism far right wing. We also conflate it with socialism that's for nationalism. But if you read the book by Charlie Chaplin from the movie The Dictator, his book was titled, I'm not giving the real title, I have to slightly modify it, but you'll know what I mean. If you look at his book, the title is This Struggle of Mine. Struggle is an inherent part of the title, and it is an inherent theme, and it's the struggle of survival and the struggle of a material world. Because as much as we like to say Charlie Chaplin was a devout Catholic, he really wasn't. He was a neo-Hegelian who held various odd philosophical views, which are for another time. Probably another platform, probably ramble, because I'm one of those people who isn't allowed to say the Uber name. But you will never have that perfect secular society which is free from religion, and you certainly won't have the society which religion has died, reason has prevailed, we're all secular now. Because even if you've got that world where religion has died, you will not have reason prevailing. Secularism is not rationality, and secularists are not rational. They are certainly not as rational as they say they are. What you end up with is a society where you have a vastly powerful government imposing secular idealism, telling us it's rational and needed for freedom, not allowing dissent, that ultimately controls even if you have an oven to cook on that night. All in the hopes of forcing us into their ideal of what the world should be like. They have this bizarre idea that if you condition people, they will eventually change because we are all tabula rasa, we are blank slates. And we're not. There's a fundamental nature to humanity. And this is something they don't take seriously when I say it, but all of the world's religions, all of them, are actually based on an understanding of the world around them and humanity and aren't just made up gibberish about sky daddies. And the reason they were able to survive and endure is because they have at least enough truth to be practical and applicable. The way they describe human nature is not false. And as much as the modern secularists would talk about how horrible the Bible is and has all these obnoxious, toxic verses, usually ones that they misrepresent, like Exodus 20, verse 17, which is actually the 10th commandment in the 10 Commandments, which says, thou shalt not covet what your neighbor has, do not covet his wife, don't covet his house, don't covet his cattle, etc. And they will say that this verse is teaching us that women are property. Because it lists a woman, it lists your wife with your property, that must mean it sees your wife as property. This is a silly argument, of course. If you actually read the sentence, its main point is to tell us not to covet what others have. And then it lists things that others have that you could covet. Nothing in the sentence is actually saying a wife is property. It is simply telling you not to covet your neighbor if he has a wife that you would like. Just as you shouldn't covet his house, just as you shouldn't covet his possessions. But they will always insist that because the wife is listed with property, it means that the Bible is saying the wife is property, and that's just nonsense. The secularists who say that about the Bible will themselves talk about having a wife, a car, a home. And that doesn't mean they view their wife in the same way they view their car and home as, property. But they don't afford that same reading to the Bible, even while they're telling us they're reading the Bible like any other book. No one would read any other book like that. They're doing it because they want the Bible to say women are property. And you see this a lot, like another verse in Exodus 21:18, where they'll say it says it's morally permissible to beat slaves, when it's not actually saying that. It's actually part of a penal code about how to punish someone. And if you actually read the entire chapter, not just one isolated verse, you realize that if you cause injury to your servant, and I say servant instead of slave because that's a more accurate translation, despite them saying slave is more accurate. But if you cause injury, you must let them go, with no qualifiers about that. And the verse that they're talking about in chapter 20, verse 18, is not saying, it is morally permissible for you to beat your slave because he's your property. It's actually saying that no further fine will be extracted from you because the servant represented money to you, because his labor would have made you money. In other words, you're already losing money by having to release the servant early. And that will be considered your compensation. No further fine will be applied. It is not saying that it is morally permissible to beat someone. That's just nonsense. But you see them making these ridiculous comments all the time, and if you explain it to them, they'll say that you're employing mental gymnastics, that you're denying the Bible means what it clearly and plainly says, that you have cognitive biases and suffer from cognitive dissonance. And it's all just idiocy. They don't try and understand the Bible, they just try and tear it down. Conversely, biblical values as actually understood by Christians, not as understood by atheists who hate religion and want to prove it evil and will have a handful of proof text verses that they'll say mean something that no one ever believed in and say, oh, you just didn't know that verse was in there, you don't know your own religion. Christianity is actually practiced by real people, acknowledges certain traits about the human condition and human nature that modern humanism simply does not acknowledge as true and in fact actively denies. And the same is actually true of Islam, or Judaism, or Hinduism, or Buddhism, or Taoism, or any of the world's great religions. They pretend it's all about arbitrary rules, about offending a fictional God, but it's really more than that, and they'll never look into it. And they'll never ask why these things were written, because even if they were written by men, there had to be a reason why men believed them. And they work. You may not agree with everything, maybe not all of it's true. But there has to be enough of it that makes it workable. And that's one thing humanism isn't. We know because even though the modern narrative is that this is the first time religion really began collapsing and secularism emerged, secularism emerged triumphant at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. And it made a comeback in the 1920s after fading. And it made another comeback in the 1960s. And as much as they would insist communism is actually a form of religion that has nothing to do with atheism, nothing to do with secularism, the ideals they're promoting in modern secularism are the same ones that the communists promoted, and their philosophical assumptions are the same. Their understanding of the human condition and human nature is the same as the communists. It's been tried, and it always fails. The most successful in terms of endurance of any secularist movement has been communism, because it is still practiced in several countries. Granted, that number is shrinking and is far less than it was in the past. They lost their signature nation, the premier communist country, the Soviet Union. Communist Russia was the first communist country, and the Soviet Union gets to claim that mantle as well because it grew out of Russia. But it lasted for about 75 years. And even today in communist China, there it is. But the thing about it is, the reason communism was able to survive is because it was adapted to the point where it's no longer enforcing true communist ideals, and also because it has the power of the state to impose it. The actual people in a society often don't live by the same ideals, especially if they live in villages or out in the country. But communism can only endure if it is imposed by such force. And secular movements that lack governmental enforcement collapse within a few years. At most, around 15 or so years. Because what they're teaching us about human nature is simply not true. The only reason secular ideals even persist is because they're parasitic and because they hide from us. They pretend not to be a religion. They pretend not to be a comprehensive philosophical system that can be questioned. They're just not religious. We're using reason on individual issues, when really they're being driven by an ideological core of ideals and assumptions that ultimately are a religion. But it's able to fail and then hide and then come back, posing as the voice of reason, largely because people don't stand up to it like I'm doing. People who are important, and it hasn't gotten in the cultural zeitgeist that we should oppose these ideas head on and not simply defend religion and defend Christian beliefs. We should attack secular beliefs. We should point out the fallacies of the secular belief system. We should point out that secularism is a belief system. It's not just neutrality toward religion. We should denounce this. But we don't. We allow it to have its little delusion where it's a great big nothing burger and allow it to hide and attack us periodically. But it still cannot survive independently of Christian religion and Christian tolerance, which is ironic because it keeps saying Christians are intolerant. But the reason that it always fails is because it is not rooted in actual reason or actual logic or actual facts. It is rooted in 19th century materialist assumptions about human nature and about the nature of our existence that have been proven wrong and that don't work, but that sound appealing to certain groups of people. Especially since it's always paired with talk of liberation. I don't have much else to say, so I shall take my leave of you now. Thank you, God bless, and goodbye.